This is probably the biggest recovery the series has ever made. I just hope they keep it up this time, but this does inspire confidence and hope that this is a launching point for something even greater going forward.
3 days later.
A remake of Pac-Man World is coming soon. Launching on Nintendo Switch August 26th.
Well, I wasn't expecting that to happen so quickly. Oh my god. Not only that, but this game was coming out on my birthday. So given that, you'd think the logical thing to do would be to play it on release date. But no, that's not what happened. Bandai Namco sent me an early copy. That said, before anything else is said, thank you so much, Bandai Namco. You did not have to do this, but it made me really happy that you did. This will not impact what I say in the video, nor has it impacted the views I have expressed elsewhere, but I'm not going to ignore this very kind gesture either. The package contained the game, the Noir Pac-Man Chogakin figure, a letter, a business card that I'm not going to show the contact info of, and plenty of party paper. Very appropriate for a game centered around Pac-Man's 20th birthday. Now if you're asking, wait, but isn't Pac-Man 42 by now? You would be correct, because this is a remake of a PlayStation 1 game, so naturally, we're going to cover that first. Pac-Man World is not the first Pac-Man platformer by any means, but it and its sequel are the most notable, and it's not hard to see why. This game does an excellent job translating the sensibilities of the original Maze games into a platformer. When looking at the original arcade game, a lot of it comes down to completionism and perfectionism. A Pac-Man game is characterized by being as simple and intuitive to pick up and play as possible, while tasking the player to be thorough with their environment, learning how to take advantage of what is laid out before you, and optimizing routes and the like upon further playthroughs. When you actually stop and think about it, those characteristics are pretty broad in potential application. You don't need to strictly be a maze game to do all of those things in a way that feels like a Pac-Man game. And Pac-Man World is perhaps the first non-maze game to really nail this concept. To demonstrate this, the game opens up with a maze incorporated in the level design, but with boxes and platforms to bounce on. To accommodate this being a platformer, the Ghost AI has been tweaked, but it still feels pretty close to the maze games. They have scatter and pursuit modes, though instead of being activated by a timer, they're based on proximity. Their movement in pursuit is directly based on your position, and through that you can draw them in and eat them in quick succession for combos. However, the platforming adds to how you navigate these spaces, and the sensibilities of the maze games also translate into it. The levels in this game are fairly linear, but instead of just rushing to the end, they're built around you being thorough, doing everything possible in them. Going back and forth, going down overlapping paths, the works. You're also incentivized to get a good score, as doing so will earn you lives. So you'll be trying to aim not just to collect everything you can, but also aiming for high ghost combos and so forth. This is one of those games where it's not just about getting through it, but doing well. You end up replaying stages a lot, trying to perfect them, take advantage of your surroundings, and optimizing your route. It taps into the same sensations that the original Maze games do, but it adds way more on top of them because even outside of that, it's just a really good platformer. One of the things that's really fun about this game and many of the Pac-Man platformers to follow is that they realize something that most of the prior games in the series never really tapped into. Pac-Man is a ball. And what do balls do? Bounce and roll, so the platforming is largely based on bouncing through levels, on enemies and switches, rolling up slopes, and so on. The controls here are largely kept really simple. You run with the D-pad or analog stick, X is jump, pressing X twice performs the butt bounce, holding square and releasing it performs the rev roll, pressing circle throws pack dots you collect, but the move isn't used that often, so most of the time you're just using a stick and 2 buttons. That's it. Why is this significant? Well, around the time as games became more complex, older players, namely the ones who were used to games like Pac-Man, complained that games those days had too many buttons, as they had a hard time getting to terms with how to play newer games. This is kept extremely obvious and mechanically simple, with more of the mechanical depth coming from how Pac-Man interfaces with his surroundings, rather than having crazy button combinations and the like. The level design is also pretty great, especially in stages like Crazy Cannonade, where basically everything ties into a single concept. being shot at by cannons. You see cannons in the background flap open and shoot at you, and there are cannons behind the camera shooting at cardboard cutouts for practice, and you have to make sure you're not in their way. Both of these are played around with very cleverly. My favorite is when the flaps go from being a background detail to being an integral part of the platforming. The stage introduces concepts and iterates off of them very well. Level themes are also a lot of fun. It's not the typical grassland, snow, fire, desert, etc. It's Disneyland. Well, mostly. You have pirates, temple ruins, space, fairgrounds, and a haunted mansion. You also have a factory that complements the story a bit. So with that, let's talk about the story. On Pac-Man's birthday, his friends and family are kidnapped by Talkman, a robotic replica of Pac-Man throwing an extravagant party, ultimately trying to obtain one thing.
Look, here I am! Love me! Don't run! How about a hug?
After rescuing his family, Pac-Man faces Talkman and finds that he's just a suit operated by a lonely ghost named Orson. In the original storyboards, Pac-Man tries to cheer Orson up, only to end up compulsively eating him. However, in practice... Pac-Man, what are you doing? What? What? Needless to say, I like the storyboard version more. The story is short and sweet. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be on par with something like Citizen Kane. After all, the story of a guy in a mansion desperately performing extravagant actions in order to superficially gain the love he feels he lacks literally is the story of Citizen Kane.
That's why he did everything. That's why he went into politics. It seems we weren't enough. He wanted all the voters to love him, too.
Whatever I do because I love you.
You don't love me. You want me to love you.
Hell, Orson is directly named after the director, writer, and star of that film.
Susan, please. You cannot go. No. From now on, everything will be how you want it, not how I think you want it. Please. You cannot do this to me.
Oh, yes, I can.
That said, there are some issues with this game, though one of them is pretty common for PS1 games, so I don't hold it against the game in particular. So the PS1 originally launched with a controller with just a D-pad, and didn't introduce ones with analog controls until later, so the D-pad was often given priority. As such, instead of full 360-degree movement, you often just had 8 directions, and this game is no exception. Weirdly, you speed up a little when changing directions in this game, and if you keep doing it, you have some insane speedrunning potential. Nonetheless, PS1 jank is a thing here. My bigger problem is that in a game very much built around 100% completion, it can be very easy to fail a 100% run in a stage. You can screw up bouncing off of something destructible, run out of time in the steel power pellet before you can crush boxes with items in them since they typically don't respawn. If this happens, you're still able to beat the stage and try again, but there's still a fair number of times where you have one shot to get something right. The biggest offender here is in the stage down the tubes, where in order to rescue Pac-Man Jr., which you need to do to beat the game, you have to go through this underwater labyrinth, and a lot of it is built around getting the steel power pellet, crushing underwater boxes you can only crush with it, and unlocking doors. If you mess up at any point, you can't do it. On that note, yes, you need to rescue each family member in the game in order to get to the final boss, but which level the key is in and which one the cage is in isn't really specified, so that makes being thorough much more of a necessity unless you know exactly what you need in order to plow through. Then there are the difficulty spikes. The second boss in particular is absurd. Look at this bullet hell monstrosity. King Galaxian can be quite the pain too, but not as much as Anubis Rex over here. Yikes. Overall, this is still a very good game. The game is structured amazingly, a lot of the level design is really good, the presentation is great, and the music is fantastic. There are issues, but they're ones that could be fixed without too much trouble. The game doesn't really need a huge revamp, but at most a few tweaks. That said, because of these issues, I feel that this game would definitely benefit from a remake. However, sometime later, it got one. And not only that, but you could play it portably. Oh, this isn't it, no. This is pod racing. No. This is the remake in question. Pac-Man World on the Game Boy Advance strives to be a one-to-one remake of the PlayStation original, and oddly enough, first impressions are good. Despite everything being redone in 2D, the engine seems to do everything possible to make this as little of an issue as it possibly could be. You have a drop shadow, objects are transparent when you're behind them, it controls fine enough. This is a solid effort. Some of the time. The problem is that the degree of polish at hand here is highly variable. It feels like they spent a lot of time on the first level, pitched it, got approved, and then told they had 1 week to do the rest. The problem isn't that they tried to adapt a 3D platformer into an isometric one. At its best, this does prove that it could work for this game. But most of the time, this feels really rushed. You can see tiles just stop because they didn't expect the player to see things that they can extremely easily. The camera, which is already zoomed in more, rarely follows you as you go down, making it extremely easy to die unfairly, not to mention things being unfairly hidden. You'd have no idea where some of these letters are unless you already played the PS1 version. Depth becomes a struggle as it goes on, with hitboxes being poorly sized, placed too close to the player, or in cases like this, so far away that it renders their placement in the level design pointless. Speaking of pointless, this port accidentally makes a very good case of how important a game's structure can be. Again, in the original, you were given lives based on your score at the end of each stage. This doesn't do that, and because of the bad depth sorting, collision mapping, and screen crunch, you're going to die way more often. So you're constantly on the verge of death, and instead of being thorough helping with that, it actually makes it worse. But don't you have to get all the family members in order to get to Talkman? Nope. Oh, but what about the Pac-Man letters? Don't those unlock bonus stages which can give you more lives? Nope. So there's no reason to collect those either. In this game designed around completionism, it is unnecessary and even ill-advised to 100% complete this game. I hate myself. So despite the levels largely being faithfully recreated, because the things around those levels aren't carried over, this game is flat out broken. And if you thought the ending of the PS1 version was uncharacteristically creepy for Pac-Man, look at this! So that was awful. Hopefully this will be better. And sure enough, it comfortably is. In fact, this is good. Like, really, really good. The controls are excellent. You have full 360-degree analog input and it feels great. The butt bounce starts out pretty stiff, but each time you use it in succession, it loosens up. And while I think the initial butt bounce is a little too stiff, the sensation of it gradually loosening up feels great. The rev roll works just as it always did, but for some reason getting up some of the steeper slopes with it didn't feel as reliable. Thankfully, just like you could in the original, you can also bounce up slopes so it doesn't cause too much trouble. You're also given a flutter jump like Yoshi, though I disagree with the button placement. Do yourself a favor and switch it to X and the rev roll to Y. You're also noticeably faster in this version, but the controls still match the level design. This means you can find a lot of ways to cut down on time, and it's really fun to experiment. Thus, the skill ceiling is heightened, and some of the longer levels don't drag on as much. This makes playing levels feel more arcadey, which suits what the game is going for. The game is also far more transparent about what levels have the keys and which levels have the characters. Additionally, you don't even have to rescue them. So long, Junior! Though steel power pellets also respawn now, meaning levels like down the tubes aren't as much of a pain anymore. Never mind, Junior! In fact, level design changes carry over from the Japanese PS1 version. There aren't as many times where you only have one shot to do something in a run. Also, in the first level, instead of the maze section being optional, you have to go through it. I like this change, and I don't like this change. Sure, it's flashy, and even pretty funny at first. However, from a gameplay standpoint, this is strictly a detriment. You can still jump, and landing has the same impact as a butt bounce, but you can't rev roll, you can't fit in a lot of places, and instead of the ghost eating tying into the platforming, this renders the platforming irrelevant. It's like if in the original whenever you eat a power pellet, the walls would disappear. It's true, it still shifts the power dynamic, but a little too much, and it eliminates your means to do literally anything else other than eat the ghosts, and you usually end up doing that pretty quickly. It just makes the game feel less cohesive and more segmented. Was this a cute experiment? Sure, but I'm not a fan of this, and I hope they don't do it in the future. That's not the only baffling decision either. As this was originally a PlayStation game, most of the music is compressed. There are some less compressed tracks on the disc used in boss fights and the Galaxian mazes, but most of the tracks haven't been heard in any other way than slightly pitched up and in lower quality. Some people were wondering if they had used uncompressed versions of the tracks for the remake, but I found this very unlikely. However, I didn't expect them to use the original tracks either. It felt more likely that they would remix the songs. Turns out I was mostly right. The higher quality tracks from the original are largely left alone, and they remix the compressed tracks. Alright, this sounds like an okay solution, trying to bring the soundtrack up to the same sound quality across the board. Or at least that's what you'd think they'd do, but no, they compressed the remixes. This confounds me. It's been a month since I started playing this, and I still can't wrap my head around it. Even weirder is that Under Pressure, despite the uncompressed version being readily available, got a remix here, and it's by far the worst one. However, on a more positive note, they added new music to the HMS Windbag fight, and it's excellent. Reminds me of stuff from Pac-Man World 2 or Ghostly Adventures. In fact, the bosses have been pretty dramatically reworked. Anubis Rex is still tricky, but it's no longer the absurd hell zone it was in the original. King Galaxian is also way easier. Frankly, maybe a little too easy. The Clown Pre is in first person, which is honestly really cool. Chrome Keeper is... oh my. Who spat in his cereal? Yeah, in the original he was a happy-go-lucky lad on a fun little stroll, but here he looks so vicious, and yet he has the same walk cycle. Not gonna lie, that's really funny. His boss fight is pretty dramatically reworked, as now there's more escalation and the general concept is more akin to the concept art more than it is the original game. Talkman, on the other hand, I think is a downgrade. To be fair, it was probably the toughest competition the remake could have had, as in the original, it's the best boss in the game. All of his attacks are moves you also have, and also communicate what move at that point you use against him. This keeps some things the same and changes other things up. Overall, though, it doesn't feel as focused or clear, but otherwise the bosses are either on par or better than the originals. The same sadly can't be said about the art direction. Like, the game looks fine, and obviously more modern than the PS1 version, but I don't know, I think it's a mixed bag. There are some things I love, namely the squash and stretch and character animations. I like how the ghosts have different animations for scatter and pursuit modes, along with how stretchy they get in pursuit. I'm more indifferent to Talkman's design, though I will say he is quite the squinty boy. Like, look at the sheer dominance in that squint. However, my problem lies more with the environmental assets. I feel a lot of them are too rigid and straight. The colors are nice and the texture work hits a nice level of detail, but the proportions aren't exactly cartoony, which is an odd fit for the very cartoony animation. The cutscenes have been changed up a bit too. One thing I really like is that they changed the ending, and now Pac-Man forgives Orson and the two become buddies. Overall, a lot of my problems with Repack are nitpicks stemming from me being a big fan of the original game. Where it counts, this remake fixes way more problems than it causes. Hey look, they even added playable credits, that's fun, I wonder if... What? This is my biggest problem with the game. It's just flagrantly disrespectful. Does Repack make improvements? Yes, absolutely, but it would be nothing without the original team. Bandai Namco's social media seem to be taking this seriously, which is good to see. However, we'll have to see how and when this results into action, because this sort of thing is serious and can get them into legal trouble. And after all of the nonsense surrounding Miss Pac-Man and At games, that's the last thing any of us really want right now. So with that elephant in the room aside, how do the versions of Pac-Man World compare? The PS1 game is an excellently crafted game that has a few quirks of the time and some things that could be improved on. The Game Boy Advance version is an unfinished mess. Repack has some baffling decisions and one really bad one, but overall it does what you would hope a remake of Pac-Man World would do. Most of the changes it makes to the gameplay are improvements, and it works very well off of the foundation that was given to them. It's the version I'd probably most easily recommend to newcomers, but there are still things I prefer about the original, and would also highly recommend playing that too.